you for joining us today. So today I am going to be taking us through a bit of an inside view as to a very big part of what I do in this space. It's quite exciting and it's quite new for me to present it in this way. I am very much open to questions at any point during the discussions. I won't be able to see anybody with their hands up, so if somebody could just speak up and let me know. Nicola, I see you're on screen, so maybe you can just let me know if anybody's got a question or anything pops up in the chat, you can just speak up. So I hope you guys enjoy what I have to show you. Let me just share my screen quickly. I'm going to go ahead and do an entire share, and you can let me know when you can see it.
Can see it.
Okay, so thanks everyone. Today we are going to be looking at how behavioral messaging improves customer engagement. It's got a number of different facets to it. The primary and bulk of this talk is very much to do with one of the processes that you can go through when crafting messaging content in particular. So this has got major focus on crafting behavioral messaging, as well as defining the ways in which it can be pushed out into environments, specifically using the ecosystem AI's approach through the ecosystem AI platform and dynamic experimentation. So the ways that I like to do with all of these talks is I like to start with a definition. I like to give everybody just a view of exactly what it is that we're talking about with regards to humans. And in this case, it's sort of trying to figure out how we define behavior, specifically human behavior. Now, behavior in a dictionary context is defined as the way in which one behaves in response to a situation or a stimulus. Now, it's very important to, I just want to draw everybody's attention to that word response. So it's got a lot to do with how we react to something that is presented to us. Ultimately, we are reactive entities in society and in our cultural settings and even in our immediate social environments. So what we can do is break this down into 5 potential ways to define behavior. Now, I'm not going to go too much into detail of each and every one of these. A large part of these come from behavioral design learning through the Maker Toolkit specifically. And they've just presented it so well that I wanted to share it with everybody here. And it's also something that I use to ultimately define that first step, right? So if we just think about how an ecosystem AI scenario normally evolves, is that we have some kind of a relationship with a client, and then it evolves into a use case. And that use case defines the parameters within which you can understand which of these 5 areas is the best definition of behavior for people in this space. And it's usually B2C type environments. So what you have is, there's environmental factors, which is one of the first that we can see over there. And then there's also systems thinking. So you've got your systems 1 and your systems 2 thinking, which is going to be easy to process versus slightly more difficult to process. And then we've got scenarios in which how do certain sequences of events ultimately influence behavior, and how do you use consequences to define actions within people in those spaces. Another one is MAP, which is defined by BJ Fogg and his behavioral constructs as well. And that's basically looking at that there are 3 primary mechanisms to define behavior, and also the willingness to act out of certain behavior. So you've got motivation, which is your M, ability, which is your A, and prompt. Now, each of these things need to be present in order for behavior to ultimately happen. And this is how BJ Fogg has defined his understanding of it. This basically said that if you have ability and prompt present, but you are somehow lacking motivation, that would hinder then the behavior ultimately taking place. So if any one of those is missing, you don't have your full map, and therefore you don't have behavior. And then the last one is just sort of understanding how is that behavior defined? Is it intrinsically motivated or is it extrinsically motivated? So is it coming from somebody's own personal desire to do something, or is it something that is environmentally influenced? I'm not going to go too much into detail of these, but it's vastly interesting. So if anybody's got any interest in any kind of behavioral design, let's definitely look into any one of these. And then I just wanted to point out that with regards to the definition of human behavior, there are a number of different things that change how humans will act, react, engage, not engage in any kind of environment. And one of the biggest things that we understand through human psychology is biases. So what are the biases that are present through our born with personality or through a number of different elements? It's interesting because biases can be influenced by context, life stage, and personality. But then context, life stage, and personality are each in their own defining characteristics or defining pillars of how somebody then acts or interacts or reacts and forms the behavior on any one of these 5 definitions. So talk a lot about human behavioral examples, but I just want to point out that a lot of what we do is very much within digital environments. Now, it's a fine line, I think, between defining the human behavioral constructs and then the digital behavioral constructs. But there is a very clear definition that needs to happen, right? So human behavioral is very much about the broader view and the human's relationship with their surroundings, with their environments, with the people around them as well. And you have a very macro picture of a human in that sense. You can see a lot more about who they are and what they do and what they want. Now, when we talk about digital, what you're ultimately doing is taking out a sliver of that macro view of the person and needing to understand what that sliver actually means and what that sliver actually is. Like the ways that people interact with their bank is vastly different to the ways that people interact with their telco provider. And it's vastly different to how they interact with their gaming platform, as well as how they would interact with their WhatsApp channels. There are very selective views and selective actions that we take depending on the digital environment. And those selected views are also extremely unique from person to person. So one of the biggest pitfalls, in my opinion, regarding any kind of digital interaction that's been happening up until this point is the billboard approach, right? It worked really well in the real world because you have a billboard, and every time you're on your way to school or you're on your way to university or you're on your way to work, or you even just every time you go to the airport, you're always going to see this billboard, right? And the billboard needs to speak to everybody because everybody is going to see it. They're all going to see it in the same place. So you can have some kind of an environmental influence on it, but it is speaking to everybody. Sadly, what we did is we have taken this billboard approach and we stuck it into digital environments, and it's lacking, like severely lacking, because what I experience when I look at my phone is vastly different to what Nicola experiences when she looks at her phone. And we need to be able to identify those differences in experience and differences in expectations as well, especially because what you have in terms of the digital platform environment is actually very personal. You're not shouting this out to the whole world and everybody's seeing the same thing. It's one person that's seeing this message, and you need to be able to speak to that one person in the way that fits them best. And so we still have this one size fits all approach. And so what we hypothesize here is that you need to have some kind of a behavioral intelligence approach to it. You need to treat everybody as though they are this one. Now, I know that's incredibly hard to do, and especially when we're talking about content, which is what we're focusing on here, messaging. You cannot craft one message, or you cannot craft 500 messages to try to communicate with 500 different people, right? So what you do is you find a kind of middle ground between this generic approach and the intelligent approach, where you have a few different messages that then try to permeate into that one person's space. So while Nicola and myself might have vastly different expectations of our digital environment that we're engaged in, Madison and myself might be a little bit more the same, and Nicola and Rob might also be a little bit more the same. And so you can begin to form these very loose parameters. I don't want to call them boxes, because it's really not a box. It's more just it's a boundary. It's a boundary that you can begin to define and tighten up over time. Ultimately, the message performance tells you how this works. I'm going to be talking a little bit more to that a bit later, but that's specifically related to the opportunities that are afforded from the ecosystem AI platform and how these messages get delivered. So, I mean, just as a note, the ultimate goal here, right, is to not just send a bunch of messages or a bunch more messages, but to understand which messages communicate with whom, and which of those individuals it communicates well with can be grouped loosely with other individuals that are similar to or within their kind of environment. So what this tells us is that human behavior needs more than a segment. So the reason why I'm hesitant to talk about boxes is because what you have with segments is you have boxes, right? And it's something that was created for a very particular purpose. It needed to happen, and the fact that it did happen was powerful in and of itself. Imagine being able to divide people by age and know that you're not going to sell a funeral policy to an 18-year-old because it's just not within their scope or their mindset. So there are some ways in which these predefined segments, or these traditional segments, as we like to call them, have their place, and they have their position, and they have their worth. When it comes to human behavior, it is actually possible to see that across segments, you could likely have the same behaviors being presented. So you could have an 18 and an 81-year-old that kind of look the same, and they want to be spoken to the same. It's either a more mature 18-year-old or a slightly more youthful 81-year-old, or it's just the fact that they both somehow bank the same. They both have the same kind of expectations of their money, or they have the same kinds of expectations of the types of games that they choose to gamble on. And so you need to be able to identify what is the actual behavior of these individuals telling you, and not just what you can see written out on a form. And so what you have then is you've got this idea of how to use what I spoke through in that definition of behavior in order to craft messages or interventions that ultimately speak to those people and help them to take an action, or help them to understand an environment a little bit better, or just to help them to be more comfortable and more loyal to your brand. And so you can play on things like their motivation, you can play on things like their personality, or even just use it to define, how does this person want to be spoken to? And so what we have here is a process from which we're moving into a space away from the one size fits all and into a space of not just behavioral design, but also behavioral intelligence. So just to give a bit of a view of behavioral design is being used in a number of different places, right? It started off within the physical world. So it was very much about landscape planning and roadways, and trying to help people in collectives, help people to find the most optimal way to engage with their environment, or to potentially get what they need to get out of an environment. One of the ways is, how do you design a square that helps people to find some kind of solitude, but that also allows people to flow within a space. One of the most amazing things that was ever done, actually, which I'm not entirely sure if this was a specifically behavioral design application, but to put a giant circle in the middle of a thing automatically creates natural flow. And so what you'll have is that people tend to go left and then they'll come from the right. And so that's why oftentimes in these big squares, you'll have a massive thing in the center that helps people to move and ebb and flow around that. So what we've done is we've taken behavioral design from the physical world and brought it into a digital world. It's not something that's new. It has been done for a very, very long time, but we bring it in a very unique way. So we test out different behavioral design constructs and mechanisms, ultimately, in order to find out which behavioral design speaks the best to which individual. And this is where behavioral intelligence comes in. So you have the behavioral design principles, things like loss aversion, which is very well known. You've got urgency and reminders and prompts. There's a number of different mechanisms that can be used. You take a handful of those, right, depending on what your case is, and then you stick it into an intelligent environment, like, for example, ecosystem AI, in which you can begin to test which of these mechanisms communicates with whom. You can bring in personality indicators. So this is where we usually bring in either spend personality or money personality or digital personality as well, in order to narrow down the scope that helps you to identify propensity to act. And then you can also bring in data analysis if you have some, and you can then define which of these mechanisms work and which don't. So this is just then how ecosystem AI ultimately, I just wanted to talk a little bit to sort of these behavioral hypotheses that we define. It very much comes from looking at a number of different facets. I was talking to Nicola about this earlier, but how, for example, personality in the ecosystem AI world is defined is by using a number of different facets. So we've got two elements which come from the real world, which is psychology and social science theory. So these are very much based on human behavioral interactions. So psychology, I mean, you've obviously got Jung, who's one of the godfathers of psychology, human decision-making. There are elements that come from the ocean model, which help us to define what it is that you can actually call a personality on a spectrum, rather than just saying like, okay, cool, you are introvert or extrovert, which is very final, very finite. And so you need some kind of flexibility within that. And in terms of the social science theories, we look at elements that make up a society. So what defines somebody within a collective? So what is it that ultimately says to you that this person is a person and that they're behaving in ways that you kind of want them or expect them to behave? And one of the great examples of this would be functionalism. So what functionalism speaks to is that every institution within a social environment, particularly within cultures, have a particular function, and our relationship to that institution is defined by its function. So one of the easiest examples of that is a bank, right? You're not going to go to a bank and tell them all of your personal stories and how terrible your day has been. Well, I guess unless you're trying to really get something out of them, but it's not really going to get you anywhere because a bank functions in a very specific kind of way. And then what we have is two of the elements that bring us into the digital world, into that digital space. Computational social science, of which is actually the bridge between the human and the data. So computational social science helps us to identify the ways in which we can bring human understanding and understand it better within a social or digital sphere, and ways in which we can ultimately analyze what we've got. I'm not sure if Jay's on the call. I'm sure he could talk a little bit more to that. But then we have data science, which a lot of people already know about, and that's where we come down to the analysis. So how do we take our human behavioral hypotheses and bring it together to create something? So I wanted to show you guys this just as a fun visual flow of what I've just shown you now in this previous slide, where you basically step through a series of very defined stairs that lead you to this thing that ultimately then runs in production. So you have your development construct, or your construct to be developed, and then you go through these steps in which you take your hypothesis and you start to tweak it and bolster it and update it and invigorate it and find a way in which it fits within your space. So if we're talking in a client example or a client scenario over here, we have the broad hypothesis, right? But as Functionism speaks, the relationship that people have to particular institutions function in a very particular kind of way. And that does go further to say that the relationships that people form with each particular kind of bank also differs, depending on the bank and the nature of its brand, right? So you'll have some banks that pride themselves on safety and security and anti-fraud, and that'll attract a certain type of person. And then you've got other banks that are more akin to people that don't necessarily have a large amount of flow of money in. And so it's easier to borrow money and easier to get money back into that bank space. So your relationship then ultimately differs depending on the bank that you have. And very many people are multi-banked. And so what you need to identify within these steps over here is, what are people's relationship to your brand? And how can that relationship be used to then help you define more clearly what the boundaries are around your hypotheses? And then when we get into production, which I'll talk a little bit more to now, that's when you really start to see things take shape. All right, this over here is an inset very much speaking to ecosystem AI's capabilities and how it helps to take a lot of these hypotheses and these approaches and these behavioral design ideas that you could potentially have and find the optimal way to use them and to have them give something back, you know, rather than just, okay, cool, let's put it out there and see what happens. And so you have this trifecta that creates a very solid basis from which you can build your communications and build your engagements in such a way that means that they are going to hit the mark. So you're not going to end up in a situation like you have with an A/B test where you're going, okay, cool, I'm assuming that people like red and I'm assuming that people like blue. So let me stick both of those out there. And I'm going to take red because 58% of people like that. So clearly it's the winner, right? That's not at all what we do. It's very much about finding those niche elements. So you take the entire color spectrum and you use your predictive models in order to then identify the propensity for people to like a particular kind of color. So you will use evidence in the data to identify the fact that this group of people are slightly more likely to like red. This group will probably like pink. This group will like green over here, right? And then you'll introduce these behavioral constructs. And then the behavioral constructs both tighten up the propensity that that person has to accept or to take up what it is that you're offering. But it also gives you the parameters within which you can begin to cross-offer. So in other words, you can begin to explore. And that brings us then to dynamic experimentation. So this is where you will have this environment in which you are both exploiting, which is going, I am pretty sure that Nicola's going to like something red, right? And exploring by going, okay, cool, but red's kind of close to pink as well. And it's a complementary color to orange. So let's just throw those in there as potential options and explore. Now, what you might find is that our hypothesis is that Nicola likes red. Sorry, Nicola, I'm picking you on you quite a bit with this one. But that is our hypothesis. And what we found through our dynamic experimentation and through our testing and through our refinement process is that she's actually more fond of pink, right? Or every now and then of orange. And she doesn't really actually like red all that much. It's just like a little bit of a thing. So the reason why I personally love this so much is because, I mean, I'm very much the analyst, right? I'm very much the person that's going, okay, cool. I have an idea of what I know comes up in the books and in the theories and the constructs and the papers that are written about all of these things, but you never really know what is going to happen in the real world, right? Especially because a lot of these papers, it's use cases and it's case studies and things like that, but it's all quite clinical, and it has to be clinical for a very particular reason, right? But the nuances of humans within these spaces is so varied. And so this is what really allows you to then communicate to people individually. So with this over here, I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but I wanted to give a bit of a sneak preview into what my daily existence kind of looks like, especially when we're approaching certain kinds of use cases or writing projects that need to happen. So there are a series of steps. There are 6 steps that I'm going to take you through, and they help you to ultimately step closer to getting something that you can then put into production and put out there. So in step 1, the most important thing is to ultimately define your context. What is the context of this thing, right? What is it going to do? What is the point? What is the purpose? What do you ultimately want out of it? That then helps you to build out the next steps of these canvases. With regards to digital environments, step 2 is vastly important because you need to know what the channel is that you're going to be speaking to people through. And the channel is also, it's a major definer of the later steps that you take, because there are certain mechanisms that work very well for emails that don't really work very well for an SMS environment, and vice versa. All right, so you define the channel or the touch point or the push space, the space in which the customer is going to be receiving this thing. All right, and then for step 3, you will select your mechanisms. Now, if we use Make a Toolkit as an example, there are a vast number of mechanisms out there, a hugely vast number of mechanisms. And each of them has a very important place and a very important role. Some of them speak directly to triggering people's biases. Some of them speak to certain past experiences that could potentially be in similarity. Some of them, like loss aversion, are extremely widely used and sometimes overused, or used not necessarily in the best kind of way, where you feel like you're being, I can't think of what the word is now, but you're being pushed too far. Right, so the mechanism selection part of this is actually a very delicate process. Now, what I tend to do is I will go quite broad with my mechanism selection. I will try to see, okay, cool, based on the channel, based on the context, what could our mechanism selection potentially be? And then what I'll do is I'll move on to step 4. So these 3 steps over here are what get us to the final messages that we have. Now, step 4 can look like a number of different things depending on the case, the environment, the company, any of that. And this is trying to figure out what are the features that we can use to speak to people. What are the features that bring some kind of value to the customers based on our brand or our offering, the product, any of that, that can be paired with these mechanisms in order to help people get to that point of motivation, right? So if we look at BJ Fogg's map, right? So this is defining, obviously, the M part of it. What is the motivation? So yeah, and then this will tell us whether we should be promoting plants. I've just got plants in my head now. We've got plants that have purple flowers over red ones, or plants that flower versus ones that don't. That's just an example of the types of features that you can use. Now, step 5 is very much within the ecosystem AI space, and this is to pair all of this with personality. Now, this personality pairing is actually vital to the entire process, because you can come up with mechanisms, you can come up with a number of different levers that come from behavioral design, and you can just put it out there, right? But without knowing the personality of the individual that will be receiving this, you can't point the right mechanism into the right place, right? Because you don't want to inundate people with messages. You don't want to have to choose 6 different mechanisms. Let's say you choose 3 mechanisms and you choose 2 of the value triggers. You're going to end up with 6 different messages, and you need to know where to send one of those messages to. So I just wanted to show this. We talk a lot about spend personality, so I'm definitely not going to go through each and every one of these, but maybe you guys can read through it a little bit while I'm talking. So you can use an understanding of their personality in order to define which mechanism paired with which feature or with which value can go to which personality. So if we take an example over here, experiential customers are drawn to engaging interactive digital experiences, right? In that very first line over there, it says to you that gamification will likely be a decent mechanism to choose in order to write these messages to gain the attention of the experiential. However, you don't want to be sending gamification messages to your intentional customers, because intentional customers, they don't want to play. They don't want to be encouraged or egged on. They don't want the Duolingo experience, right? They just want to learn something, and they want to act on something, and they want to keep their lives simpler. And so while I did talk about the explore exploit earlier, knowing their personality also helps you to define the breadth in which you can experiment with these particular levers or these particular mechanisms, right? So if we take this experiential gamification pairing, you can definitely explore a little bit up to industrious. You can potentially explore into the extrovert space, and you can definitely explore into the enthusiastic space, all right? But you wouldn't explore with the introvert, and you wouldn't explore with the intentional, right? Just based on the personality profiles that we see here. And once all of this is done and everything is brought together, and we've got, you know, the context and the mechanism and the value and the personality of them and the channel through which all of this is going to be pushed, this is where the fun stuff happens. This is where you can start to craft out your message matrix. Now, I think for a lot of marketing teams and a lot of businesses in general, the idea of a message matrix is perhaps a little bit overwhelming, because I think a lot of places are used to going, okay, cool. So, you know, we want to sell this new watch. And so what we're going to do is we're going to come up with, this is our brand, and this is what the watch does, and this is the message that we're going with. Okay, cool, it's sold. Stick it on a billboard, put it on everybody's phones, stick it in an email in long format. But it's ultimately one message that is pushed everywhere. And it's one message that is pushed to everyone. What we suggest with the message matrix is that you can have up to 50 different messages. Yes, 50 different messages that get pushed out. And these 50 different messages have subtle variations, either in mechanism or the value trigger that's been chosen. They're variants depending on which personality you're going to send them to. And if you have multiple channels, like the example that I gave now that you would like to push it to, you would have variations on those channel contents as well. What you do once you've got this message matrix, 50 messages, 500,000 customers, you need to then push it out there. So what we do is our platform creates the push, right? And based on the inference, which is what I've just been speaking to now, you've got your hypothesis, and then you intervene and you learn. So we've actually moved over to the left-hand side, and this is where you will put messages out into the system or into the digital environments, and you will learn from feedback. So you will figure out that over a course of time, depending on what your time frames are, that Nicola and people like Nicola are very fond of pink. Okay, cool. Let's stick them in a space in which they get a little bit more pink, and then every now and then you'll explore and give them a little bit of orange. In this case, it'll be a certain type of message style that Nicola responds to better, that you then occasionally explore with the other message styles. Now, what often happens within this space over here is that you'll start with a relatively small subset. You'll learn a bit of something from a small subset of people. You will then take your understanding of, okay, cool, in this small subset, we've noticed that the extroverts are quite fond of a particular kind of mechanism. The introverts are relatively undefined. The experientials, they're kind of loving them all. What do we do with this? You get a slightly bigger group of people, and you use that smaller group's learnings to determine your intention or your propensity to react to certain things that you're pushing out. And then you will test a little bit more. So in that slightly bigger group, what you might find is that your experientials are kind of all over the board, but they're starting to converge. You will start to see a convergence on preferences. You will start to see a convergence on elements or language or mechanisms that actually trigger behavior. Now, this does tend to take time, and you'll see this with the observation step over there. This will often happen in batch. So while the system pushes messages out, learns, and then updates in real time, your observations that you will ultimately go back and do will happen in a series of batches over time. So this is also quite an exciting part of the process, the observation part. You can start to really see just how well your hypotheses were formed, just how well your pairings were put together, and you can start to tweak certain things. So you can potentially try to disrupt the system that you've already created by throwing something in there that's quite radical and testing it across the board or exploring across the board. You could also then potentially decommission some messages within your set that you see are just not performing very well at all. You can also switch out certain messages. So if you can see that there are messages that are not performing as well as you wanted them to, you had a really, really strong belief in the fact that that hypothesis was going to play out. Perhaps it was just the wrong word. Or perhaps it was just the wrong time of day that you put that out there. And you can make these subtle tweaks, and they all happen immediately. And you start to see how the learning then operates based on that. So this over here, I just wanted to give a bit of a view of what I mean by these mechanisms. So this is just a bit of an example of, you've got many customers and there are many ways to talk to them. And there are also many ways to use these mechanisms. So one of the ways that you can do it, which is probably the simplest, is to use one mechanism at a time to define the language of your message. So let's take loss aversion, which I've spoken to quite a bit here. So loss aversion is to highlight the unused value or the missed opportunity. This can come across very easily in your messages. You can say something about, before the time runs out, you've got to top up now. But what happens if you have these scenarios in which people start to feel slightly more anxious about not having this thing, and it'll make them likely to react to that. Now, just based on what I've been talking about, I'm wondering if there's anybody here going, I can maybe see why some personalities would not react particularly well to a loss aversion message. Or if the mechanism that you choose, if you choose one mechanism across all the messages and across all the personalities, how you would need to reframe the language that you use for that mechanism in order to speak better to each of those personalities. Yeah. And then one of the other approaches that you can do is to actually pair up your mechanisms. So you can have a combination of loss aversion and, actually, let me choose a better one. You can have a pairing of ease and recognition, right? So you both make the customer feel seen. Reciprocity is a great word for it as well. So reciprocity, let's use reciprocity and ease. So you show something to the customer that makes them feel like they were the ones or the reason why this thing exists in its current format. So you say to them, you know, because of you, we've made something so simple. All you need to do is click here and you can receive it. And then just like as a final note, to show a little bit of an example case that has actually been in play and that we have seen measurable uplift from is a messaging campaign within a gaming environment where you had originally one-size-fits-all communications and a number of different campaigns across the board. One of the things that was quite profound about this case in particular was that incentives were always present, right? Incentives is another mechanism that can be used. So what you'll often find is that particular kinds of brands and companies, especially depending on their marketing team, will gravitate towards specific kinds of mechanisms. But what you'll have is that they'll use the same mechanism with the one-size-fits-all approach. So while they are using some kind of behavioral design mechanism, they're just not varying it enough to speak to people who wouldn't respond to that particular kind of mechanism. One of the things that this particular company was really good at was incentives and ease or simplicity. So everything was very straightforward and very much like, you will win, you will earn, you will get this thing. Here is a thing, do something with it. And yet, when we came in, you think, okay, cool, incentive-based, you're pretty much guaranteed to get people responding to it, right? People love to receive free things. But what we found in this space over here was that there was a major uplift just in a very, very, very simple change, which was to craft 5 different messages for the same purpose. One incentive, 5 different messages based on 5 different mechanisms. And there was a major increase in people actually taking up that incentive. People going, oh, okay, cool, this is something new. Or wow, this is speaking to me. Why have I not seen any of this before? And so, yeah, it was just quite a nice way to see how all of these elements and all of these steps that go into the process of building out content and ultimately just a message, right? I mean, it's just words in your cell phone that come to you, but it is so incredibly important to like finally being able to speak to people that you weren't necessarily being able to speak to before. Well, thank you. On that, I'm gonna open up the floor to any questions if anybody has. Yeah, I don't know if anybody wants to see the use case again.
That was really great, Jess. I always find it so interesting.
Yeah, same.
Thank you, Daniel. Much appreciated. Yeah, I don't know if anybody's got any questions for me or even some thoughts or ideas that perhaps cropped up while I was talking. It might have been a lot. I did kind of tried not to scream through it, but I did definitely feel like I was talking quite a lot. So I don't know if there was anything that struck anybody about or inspired. I don't always quite like to do. All right.
I don't think there are questions, but I do want to make the note that this use case will soon be available on our website where you can download it and review. And if you ever want to set up a meeting with Jess to share more, so she can share more insights, there's always that option as well. But yeah, thank you, Jess. I think that was a really great detailed presentation.